Welcome to the Scale Molder Geek. I was sitting around in front of my computer one day, scrolling through Facebook, and up popped this image. And as soon as I saw the image, I thought, geez, I really got to build that. I just loved the tones of the train and the trees, the rusty train in front of that greenery of the forest. And I thought this would make a fantastic project. So it was off to the hobby shop. And the only train, unfortunately, they had in stock was this Revell kit. It's the 1/87 scale big boy locomotive. Little did I know at the time that this was actually the biggest steam train ever produced, and what that created was a very large diorama for me. I really didn't want a locomotive that long, but it was the only plastic kit that I could find. One of the rules I've set myself that is when I build a diorama, I like to incorporate some figures, mainly because this then gives it a sense of scale. Talking about scale, at 1/87 scale, these figures are only 30mm high. Now I also printed up some little doggies and some cows as well, which I'll show you a little bit later. Now I got these from Thingiverse and they're free, but I did do some modifications. I swapped some heads over in a piece of software called Blender, as well as added some backpacks to some of the figures that were just walking. I wasn't a huge fan of the train kit once I opened it up. It just felt like the moulding was a bit clunky on it. So I did a bit of hunting around, found some reference images, and one thing I noticed was the handrail along the side of the train there was actually moulded part of the train in the kit. And it turned out to look like a piece of flap. And you can see the strip there down the side. It's just, yeah, it's terrible. So I figured I need to chop that off and then replace it with some steel wire. So using some nips, I just went along the plastic flap, that's what I call it because I have no idea what else to call it, and just snipped around the little support sections and then scored the rest of it and then snapped them off. Surprisingly, it turned out to be a lot easier than I thought it would be. Didn't take long to complete, and with a bit of sanding to the areas that had the flaps on there, it came up rather nicely. To replace that handrail, I use a 0.8 aluminium wire. And I started off with drilling some holes in the cabin and then the front section of the train. And then I bent the wire to actually the necessary shape. Again, this turned out to be a lot easier than I thought it would be. I spent a bit of time making sure the wire was quite accurate and ran along the areas that I needed to. And when it came to actually super gluing into place, again, another easy job. It was just a matter of holding against the supports that I had cut around. And that was the finished result. How good does that look? So much better than those flaps. With that completed, onto the rest of the train. Now there's 3 sets, if I remember rightly, of these bogies. I think that's what they're called. If I'm incorrect, leave a comment in the comments. This is the first train I've ever built, so it turned out to be quite a fun build. Really enjoyed doing it, and I was able to complete it in one evening. Now off camera, I gave a bit of a spray job. I used 3 different browns. I started off with this German red, followed with the rust and some light rust. And I just mottled up the colours, giving them kind of an uneven finish to it. Now I've got the base rust colours down. I want to add a bit of texture to it as well. Now I'm using this Vallejo rust texture. But one of the things I kept in mind was, as 1/87 scale, I've got to be very careful of how much texture I put onto it. Because at that scale, you really don't want too much texture. Here I'm just using a piece of sponge to apply it onto the kit. And that's the final result. Starting to get there. Now it looks a bit heavy at the moment, but we'll get this wash, which will then unify everything together and kind of tone it down as well. Now a quick spritz of water, the reason I do that for is it actually helps the wash flow a lot easier. Now I'll give it a good solid wash over the whole thing. making sure I get into all the crevices. And then I use some of this panel line accent colour from Tamiya just to help to bring out some more of that detail. I love this stuff, I use it everywhere. And you can see it straight away accentuates a lot of the detail. Really adds a lot of depth to the actual kit. Now it's looking really good, but I kind of feel it needs a bit more texture to it. So I decided to use some of these Vallejo pigments and some of that sepia from Vallejo. And I've mixed the two compounds together and started applying it to the bottom areas of the train and highlighted some of the top areas as well. And this really gave me a nice soft texture to it, without obviously overdoing it. It's looking really good, but I kind of think it still needs one more thing. I think I need to add some rust streaks. So I've got these weathering pencils from AK, and I used them on my last project and I really liked them, so I'm going to use them again on this train. Now I'm using these a little bit differently. I actually wet the tip of the pencil and use a brush to apply it. I just find I get more control out of it. Bit unorthodox, but hey, that's what modeling's all about. I'm just adding these streaks to where I would feel like they kind of visually look interesting. And this time, I think I'm happy. The train is done, and the tender. Hey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like the video so far. Would love your support. With the train done, it's time to do the diorama base. Now I'm using some XPS foam here. This stuff's really cheap and I just got it from my local hardware shop in Australia. It's Bunnings. Now I'm just trying to work out the composition here. Now I've got a lot of trees I need to add to it, as you saw in the reference images, so I kind of decided if I put it on an angle towards the end of it's going to look a bit thin with the trees. I've decided to go lengthways on the board to give the best impact with those trees. Now I need to raise those railway tracks, so I'm using some foam core board here and some PVA glue just to glue it into place, and having a quick layout to get a fair idea of what's going on. I'm cutting off the edges because when I add a bit of terrain there, I really don't need sharp edges. Now to make the terrain, I figured I'll use a technique I haven't used in a gazillion years. Some paper mache. I haven't made this stuff since I was in primary school. Now I pulled out my little coffee grinder, chopped up some old envelopes that I had laying around, and I ended up with this bowl of goodness. Now to hold it all together, some PVA wood glue, and a little bit of water as well to thin it down. I kind of got carried away with the water. It turned out to be too thin, so I needed to chop up some more. And look at that, looks like I'm making some witch's brew. All that dust. So I mashed up some newspaper this time around, and you can see it's a lot more fibrous. Very different. So I threw that in the bowl, mixed it all together with the white glue and the water. To help the paper mache stick down to the base, I just primed it all with some PVA glue. Boy, this brings back some memories. I still had a bit too much moisture in the paper mache, so I just ended up cleaning that up with some paper towel. That got rid of it. Left it to dry overnight, then gave it a coat of some more of this PVA glue, just to seal it all. Off to the hardware shop again, got myself some of this acrylic brown paint and gave the whole base a coat of this paint. Now in retrospect, I probably should have used a different colour. Probably should have gone for maybe like a dark grey, because some of this brown ended up coming through the ballast once I glued it down. And for the edge of the base, some of this black. Now to paint the rails, start off with the base coat of this rust. and then some of this light rusts in some random areas over the tracks. Here I'm just using some super glue just to hold the railway tracks in place until I actually add the ballast, and then when I glue that into place, that should really hold it down. With that done, I still need to add a bit more detail to the tracks. So I'm dry brushing all the sleepers with some of this light sand from Ammo. And this really brings out a lot of the detail. But you can see it's very, very bright, so we need to tone that down a bit. And I'm going to use a mixture of this black and some deck tan, and I'm going to water that down to create a wash. And then completely over the tracks with that. Like I said, this tones down the dry brush and also goes into the recessed areas and adds a bit more depth. I'm using this rust wash for the actual tracks, just to add a bit more rust to it. Now I've got this ballast that's been sitting around my place for about 25 years. I don't even know when I got it or why I got it. But I seem to have it laying around. I'm not even sure if it's the right scale, but I'm going to use it anyway because I have it. Now I'm just adding some masking tape to the end there just to stop that ballast from falling over the edge. So I get a nice clean edge there. Sprinkling it into place, and then with this flat brush I'm just making sure the sleepers are all exposed. Using a mixture of very diluted white glue or PVA glue in a spray bottle, I spray the whole area very heavily and then leave it to dry overnight. Now it's time to add some scenery to the base. I'm using some of this static grass, 7mm dark green, and some wood glue. Again, PVA, same stuff. Now I bought this really cheap static grass applicator on eBay, and yeah, it was pretty average, but the only reason I bought a cheap one because I didn't think I was going to get much use out of it. It kind of worked, it did the job. And the old stocking on the vacuum hose to suck up all the excess grass. Now it's time to make some bushes. Now I've got this rope that I'm using, as you can see, and I'm going to just unfray it and try and get some gnarly like branches out of it. I'm just adding some masking tape just to stop the rope from fraying. If you haven't, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe. I'd love your support. I ended up not having to use the whole rope there. All I needed was about 3 strands out of that piece of rope. It was a much nicer looking bush. Well, it soon will be. Now I'm just unfraying it as much as I possibly can here. And look at that, it's starting to look like something. Now I'm using some of this lichen that I've had for years and years and years, and you can see by the price, $3.25. Jeez, that is old. Now what I did with this stuff actually, because it was so soft and yucky, I actually threw it in the oven, dried it out and crushed it down, and look how good that came out. And to stick that on, some of this Seller's Quick Grip, and off camera I gave those little bushes a coat of brown paint. Now I'm just flocking it over with that lichen or lichen, whatever you want to call it, I don't care. And now it's starting to come alive. Look at that, it's starting to look like a real bush. Quite frankly, I was surprised how well they came up. I did trim them up a bit later on once they completely dried to get a nicer shape to them, but I still wanted to keep them a bit wild. Now, this was actually my first attempt. I used a bit of foam on this one. You can see how foamy it looks compared to my second attempt at it. Now, that was my test one. Such a difference. I'm so happy I tried the second technique. Now onto the most time consuming part of the whole diorama, which was trees. And I'm just using some 5mm dowel here, or balsa dowel. And I'm cutting lengths between about 12 centimeters and 20 centimeters. And then sharpening the top end. That's the peak of my tree. And then the length of it, just giving an uneven finish to it. And look at that. I'm ready for any vampire. Come and get me. Now for the actual branches, I'm using some of this wire. Now I ended up cutting that in about 3 centimeter lengths. And I needed quite a fair bit per tree. Now I had a larger diameter wire which I used for the base, and I just super glued that into position. And this will help me stick it into the base. And here we go. Now this is very time consuming. I ended up having 13 trees, so that's a lot of branches I had to actually stick on there. Once you start, you get into a bit of a rhythm and it gets through it pretty easily. But like I said, a bit time consuming. The only issue I had was some of the balsa wood was hard and some of it was soft, so yeah. That's one of the harder ones. Once they were done, I trimmed them to shape to make them look like a pine tree. Once I got to this stage, I kind of started to get excited because it was starting to actually look like something. And you can see it's got the shape. So we're heading in the right direction. And there you go, 13 of them. That took about roughly 2 hours to actually complete. Now I found this technique from a YouTube channel by Luke Towan. I'll leave the link in the description. Now with the power of magic, and just like that, we have brown trees. But we still need to add a bit of texture to the trunk, because it kind of still looks a bit balsy. We need to get rid of that. And I'm going to use some of this fine turf. It's T41. And spraying with a bit of that Sally's glue, and then sprinkle it over the top of the trunk. And this really gives it a nice barky looking finish to the trunk. Look at that, no longer looks like a piece of dowel. Very nice if I do say so myself. Now to add the smaller branches, some of this 7mm static grass, and it's the straw. And just some PVA glue on the actual branches because I don't want to get it onto the trunk. So I'm just making sure I get a nice solid coat of PVA glue on them. And then we start sprinkling with some of that straw grass. Straw grass, is that a thing? It is now. Now I ended up having to do a couple coats of this to thicken it up. And for the second round, I ended up using some of the spray adhesive. Very carefully. And off camera, some of that brown paint again. And I just used it straight out of a rattle can. With that done, it's time to add the leaves. Now I'm starting off with this 2mm straw. And I'm going to glue it on with this hairspray from Silhouette. Because it's a little bit cheaper. And it works exactly the same as the other stuff, which is far more expensive. Now I'm just adding the straw grass to the bottom of the tree, and that's the areas that it doesn't get much sunlight, so it's a little bit drier. And being very, very careful I don't get it on the trunk. And if you do, you can always brush it off. And about this stage I decided it needed a bit of a trim. It was starting to get a bit out of control, so I'm just shaping it. And now some of this 2mm mid-green. And I'm doing that to the center of the tree. In retrospect, I should have covered the whole tree with it, or rather the top portion of it. Make sure I do that next time. And then onto this dark green for the top of the tree, and I kind of blend it into the lighter green. This portion of the tree making was actually quite relaxing. I enjoyed this bit. I went into my Zen mode. And there's my tree. Looks great. Really happy with the turnout. With the trees done, it was time to finish off the base. Now I'm adding more grass here, so I went out and actually upgraded my static grass applicator, because I was really enjoying creating this type of base, this type of terrain, so I figured I'm going to get a lot of use out of it. And I did a bit of a gradient from green to the dried areas, because I figured the paths underneath the trees would be more dried out than actually green. So what I'm doing here is just doing a rough placement, just trying to work out a composition for the trees before I actually glued them into place. With the pins that I had inserted into the bottom of the trees early on, this made this process a lot easier to do. I was able to just, pop the trees in different areas until I was happy with them. And that's what they look like. And it was time to lock all the trees into place with some PVA glue. Now let's not forget our little bushes that we made earlier. Now I'm placing a majority of the bushes at the back of the train, or rather at the edge of the forest, just to give it a bit of thickness to the forest. And I temporarily put the train back just to give me an idea where I'm going to put the front bushes. With the base all done, I needed to leave it for a couple more hours for it to dry before I could do any more work on it to make sure all those bushes were secure. So I need to do one more thing to the train. Now in the original reference image that I saw, there was this bush growing out of the tender, and I really liked that idea, so I wanted to replicate that. So I made sure I had one more bush left over for myself, and using a hot stick gun, I glued that into the tender. Now I'm just using some of this coal from Woodland Scenics, because the moulded coal looks kind of terrible. So a quick coat of PVA glue just to make sure that the coal doesn't run everywhere and sort of holds it into place. I then use this little spoon to load up the coal into the tender. And to hold all the coal into place, I had this little drip bottle filled with diluted white glue, a couple drops of dishwashing liquid just to stop the tension. That just makes it flow through the coal very easily. Hey, if you haven't smashed that like button, do so and subscribe to the channel. Muchly appreciated. Now it was time to glue the train down onto the tracks, and boy, this was a nightmare, just trying to align those wheels onto those tracks. And for the final stage of the diorama build, it was time to paint these figures. Now I've given them a coat of black, and then with some white paint gave them some zenithal lining, and this technique gives me all the shadows that I need. With all the colours that I use in painting these figures, I add a bit of glaze medium, and what this does is actually gives the paint a bit of an opaque finish to it, and it shows the zenithal lining through the paint, hence giving me all the shadows that I need. Like I said earlier, these are the smallest figures I've ever printed, so painting them was a bit of a challenge. And to add a bit of detail, I added some of that panel line accent to the clothing as well as the backpack. As fiddly as they are, I really believe you need figures to add scale to a diorama. I think this dude with the binoculars looks really cool, probably my favourite figure. The story behind this diorama is set slightly in the future, and there's been a major event that's wiped out most of humanity. And we have a bunch of travellers, travelling all over the countryside, trying to meet up with a whole bunch of other survivors, if there are any survivors, And we have our lookout team up top there, just checking out terrain to make sure there's no nasties hiding out there. I'm just using some super glue to hold the figures into place. And you can see, as soon as you add figures to a terrain, it really brings it to life. What are those nasties I hear you say? Well, it's zombie cows, of course. What else would it be? Printed these up on my 3D printer. Gave them a bit of blood and guts on the exposed areas and some bones. And they look so cool and different. With these zombie cows glued into place, I think it's time for the glamour shots.